Welcome to the Real View podcast, where Ohio Realtors connect you to innovators and influencers, keeping you with the real view of real estate. Whether you're a broker, agent, first-time homebuyer, industry leader, or just happen to stumble upon our podcast today, you can expect to hear tips, tools, tricks, interesting information, and so much more from the experts in Ohio's real estate game. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of the Real View podcast. I'm your host, Allison Wiley. With me today is our special guest, Sean Malone, who is a Shaker Heights City Council member. Sean, thank you for joining me today. Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on today, and we're going to talk about Shaker Heights. I'm assuming your hometown, or at least where you reside now. And the topic of this podcast actually came up on another podcast I was recording, and I don't remember exactly how it came up, but I was like, you know what? It's such an interesting city. It touches and experiences so many topics that I'm sure a lot of other cities throughout Ohio and the country face. And I said, this might be a really interesting podcast to have an episode on. And I found Sean. He did a great article on Shaker Heights and his perspective of the city and some things that it experiences. And I'm like, let's get him on the podcast. He is super knowledgeable about the city. So I'm really happy to have you on, Sean. But before we get started and dive into Shaker Heights and the city and kind of what we'll be talking about today, I want to hear from you, our signature question. What is the best view that you've ever seen?
Well, first, Allison, thank you very much for the interest and the opportunity to be here. I'm always happy to talk about Shaker Heights. The best view I've ever seen is a question that can be taken many ways. I mean, the obvious answer as a politician would be to say something about Shaker Heights. But I'm gonna resist that temptation, and I'm gonna say, actually, with the name Sean Malone, you might imagine I'm Irish. My middle name is Patrick. I'm gonna mention a view that I had on a trip that I took with my brother when I was very young. We visited Ireland, and we climbed up a hill outside Dublin called Howth Head, and it overlooks the Irish Sea, and you can see over to Wales and England, and it was a beautiful day. Flowers on the mountainside. It was just gorgeous. So I'm going to go with that.
Love that. Awesome. Yeah, very cool. I always like to hear our guest vacation travels and hear about where they've been. And Ireland, I've never been, but I know it's beautiful, and I would love to visit someday. So very cool. Yeah. And I didn't make the Irish connection either. So that's cool. Thanks for sharing that as well. Okay, cool. Well, let's get started and talk a little bit about the founding of Shaker Heights. What was the vision for this city? And some of you may be familiar. It's been in pop culture a little bit, most recently with the Little Fires Everywhere book / TV show that was pretty popular. And we know from that it was a planned community / a garden city. So tell us a little bit about that, about the history of it. It's quite the historical city, and a lot of planning and discussion went into kind of the founding of the city. Tell us about it.
Sure. Well, Shaker Heights has been around for more than 100 years now. It was founded, as you mentioned, founded in, I think, 1912, designed to be what's referred to as a garden city. So it was supposed to be an exclusive getaway for wealthy residents who lived in the Cleveland area. Very little to no commercial development. It was supposed to be residential only, and it was connected by a rapid transit line, which was innovative at the time. Public transit that took people to and from downtown Cleveland, designed by the Van Sweringen brothers, who had a railroad empire. Oris and Mantis, who came from the Worcester area and developed. They bought the land from folks who had acquired it from the Shakers. That's how our city gets its name. Shakers were a religious sect that lived for several hundred years in this area and created the Shaker Lakes by damming some streams that ran through the city. But from its founding, Shaker was always meant to be a wealthy, exclusive resort. And that's really how it developed in its first, I would say, 30, 40 years of existence.
Yeah, that's cool. And I like that you brought up the exclusivity of it. And for our listeners who may not know, could you explain what a garden city or a planned community, kind of what that means and some of the components that go into that?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of history in this, and there's been, dating back into 18th and 19th century city planning, but it's, lots of trees, big public parks, homes that are spread out. Again, the biggest thing is very little diversity of land use. You don't have mixed use developments, which are very much in vogue these days, office and retail all in the same setting. But I think with that Garden City exclusive mentality and design came, an emphasis on an exclusivity. So Shaker was not only for certain people, it was not for other people, particularly Jews, Catholics, and especially Black people. There were restrictive covenants from the early days put in place by the Van Swearingen Land Company. Sometimes they were in coded language, sometimes they were more explicit, but they often required the consent of all neighboring or adjoining landholders before any transfer of property could occur. And so that served to keep folks out that were not welcome. So while on the one hand, Shaker became one of the, I would say, wealthiest, most exclusive suburbs in America, I think at one point in the 60s, it was known as the wealthiest per capita place in America. That came with a downside. And, when Black people tried to move in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of resistance from whites in the area. There was even a kind of a notorious firebombing of a couple's home in either the late 50s or the early 60s. But that led, so there's that side of Shaker's history, which, we would prefer not to remember, but we need to learn from. And I think one of the most remarkable stories about Shaker is the way that residents in that community, for example, Ludlow, and then also in Lomond, came together, white people and Black people, to work towards integrated schools and neighborhoods. Now, these efforts were not perfect. They were a start, and I think it's what the city likes to remember these days as a positive outgrowth of the way our city developed.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned, it's certainly not a topic that, anyone is proud of or really, wants to bring up, but it is important to reflect and remember and like you said, learn from. And one of the things that I've been learning about too is redlining and some of the issues and how redlining affected, some of these racial groups. And I know Shaker kind of experienced a little bit of redlining as well. Would you mind just giving our listeners kind of a background on what redlining is and how Shaker experienced it?
Yeah, and I was alluding to this earlier with those restrictive covenants. I mean, that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that lending institutions, banks and others, just would not lend to Black people or would not show houses in certain neighborhoods to Black people. I mean, we have in Shaker geographical divides with the two rapid transit lines running through the city. And so if you're south of the rapid tracks, those neighborhoods typically have been African American. North of the tracks, white families lived there. And for many years, I think there were unwritten rules about where real estate agents would show people homes, and banks would not lend as readily. There's a lot of history to that. But what I like to remember about Shaker's history is I feel like I'm a product of the efforts to try to start to undo some of that. Because by the time I went to school, I started in the Shaker schools. I went kindergarten through 12th grade in the Shaker schools. In the early 80s when I started kindergarten, and Shaker was already a much, much more diverse place. I think by the 70s and early 80s, I think the demographics were very similar to what they are today. I mean, it's a majority Black school district, high school more than 50% African American, and this is one of the best educated communities in Northeast Ohio, and frankly in all of the state when you factor in the number of postgraduate degrees held by residents here. So yes, there's been a history of redlining, and we still have the vestiges of that today. We still have neighborhoods, people that are, I guess, de facto segregated, and we're no longer forced to live in segregated neighborhoods. But people, by human nature, tend to congregate and live near those who have similar backgrounds. So, we still struggle. We have, I guess you could say, segregated youth sports teams. We have segregated lunch tables, I think, to some extent today. And we still have social networks. And this is not unique to Shaker by any stretch, but where people socialize with those who look and sound similarly to the way they do.
Yeah. Is there any specific intentional efforts or things that the city is doing to kind of help with that segregation?
Yeah, and I guess I use the term segregation. I want to be clear that there's no active efforts by the city or schools or anyone to keep Shaker segregated. I'm just talking about America in general tends to be a segregated society. But absolutely, the city and the school district in particular have taken some, I would say, radical steps in recent years. The school district, while I, again, touted all those wonderful statistics for it, we've got a highly educated population. We've got lots of children of teachers, children of doctors, children of lawyers, and financiers living in our communities. But in some respects, we've had a school district that's almost been separate but unequal because we've had advanced placement classes and college, honors classes primarily attended by white kids. When I was there, that was the way it was, and it still is that way today. African American students taking the college prep classes, so that the school district is trying to detrack. They're trying to make these AP tracks and honors tracks and available and accessible to everybody, regardless of background. It's a very challenging initiative because it asks a lot of teachers to reach kids who have all different abilities and all different readiness, levels of readiness, I would say. And then on the city side, while kids who grow up in Shaker, I think, are much more comfortable talking about race and the challenges that racial issues raise, adults, I think, we tend to get in, as I said, in our social networks, we tend not to talk about these things. And so I think the city, which primarily deals with the adults in our community, has not really done as much as the schools has over the years. The schools have had a group called a student group on race relations. There have been a number of other groups where high school kids go into classrooms and elementary school classrooms and talk to kids at a young age about differences and inequities that are the result of discrimination. At the city level, for the past couple of years, I chaired a group called the Human Relations Task Force. We were trying to find ways to bring people together from different backgrounds and make Shaker more welcoming, regardless of where you grew up. And our work has gradually morphed into a new committee. We hired a new diversity, equity, inclusion coordinator within the last few months, and we're going to have a full-fledged city committee looking at all both the city's internal hiring and procurement practices through a lens of making them more inclusive. But we're also trying to continue a lot of the volunteer work we were doing on the task force, just reaching out to people in the community and having fun, shared experiences. Because I think it can be exhausting for people to talk about, have the serious racial conversations all the time. But often it's just better to get to know people on a one-on-one basis, build connections that way, go to sporting events with your kids and have cookouts and go to music concerts. So we're trying to maintain some of that. Let's have fun together. Let's build community. And then it's a little easier to have difficult conversations about race.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that, some of the things that task force did, like teaching English classes to some international new arrivals of immigrants. I think that that's a really great initiative and really shows the effort that you all are making on in a tangible way to make Shaker more welcoming and open to all. So in addition to kind of some of the, integration that we're hoping to improve in Shaker Heights, what other challenges does the city face, being such a historic city and now being more than halfway through 2021? What challenges does the city face from that perspective?
Well, I like to talk about trying to make an exclusive city more inclusive, and we've talked a little bit about that. But that's just one part of, I think, a great tagline that I can't take credit for, but that the city is using now, where we're trying to modernize a historic city. Because like many smaller suburbs in Ohio and elsewhere, we have aging infrastructure. We have 100-year-old sewers, 100-year-old trees. Our trees are beautiful, but our canopy is diminished. Our housing stock, approaching 100 years old. And we don't have much in the way of economic development. Well, I should say we haven't historically had much in the way of economic development in the city because of the way it was designed. As I said, it was designed to exclude, commerce, and people were not allowed to work in their homes for many years. We didn't have many commercial districts. So, I would say we're modernizing our city. We're trying to improve our infrastructure, and I can talk in more detail about each of these things. Improve our infrastructure, improve our housing stock, and then, alleviate the tax burden on our residents, because we are one of the highest taxed municipalities in Ohio, largely as a result of our outstanding public schools, which people continue to support through levies. But that puts a lot of burden on homeowners in our community. And so we're trying to alleviate that burden by diversifying the tax base, getting more businesses into Shaker.
This episode of The Real View is brought to you by the Ohio Association of Community Colleges. Ohio's network of community colleges provides accessible training that accommodates the busy lifestyles of aspiring real estate professionals at half the price of a traditional university. With convenient locations in every part of the state, as well as online options, Ohio's community colleges are your smart choice for pre-licensing education. For more details or to start the journey to a real estate career, visit the education page at ohiorealtors.org and then click on the pre-license course locations.
Yeah, and I would love specifically, maybe if you want to go into a little bit more detail about the housing, since this is an Ohio Realtors podcast, I would love to kind of know if you all are experiencing some of the housing challenges that Ohio is experiencing, and certainly throughout the country as well, just with some low inventory and affordable housing. And what are you seeing from that perspective? And can you share some ways or initiatives that you guys are working to alleviate some of the housing issues?
Sure. Well, Cleveland, I guess I'll start with Cleveland since we are right next to Cleveland. And it's hard to talk about Shaker Heights or any of the inner ring suburbs of Cleveland without talking about Cleveland's problems. It was hard hit, Cleveland, by the foreclosure crisis in 2008. Shaker actually, I would say, did better than any of the other inner ring suburbs for lots of reasons. We still had residual wealth here. We still do. But we also have a very aggressive point of sale inspection process in Shaker that requires all housing code violations to be corrected as part of a sale. Residents have to put funds in escrow to make sure that happens. So I think while we did have foreclosures in Shaker, we had houses that were torn down, we had vacancies. There were not nearly in the number of any of the surrounding suburbs. So, and I'll just note the census data that came out in the last week or two showed that Shaker Heights, actually, our population increased by about 3 or 4%, I think, since the 2010 census. We went up by 1,000 people, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you consider that Cleveland had dramatic declines, and I think almost every other inner ring suburb lost population from 2010 to 2020. So I think statistics like that are a validation of that program. It can definitely be onerous for residents sometimes to correct those point of sale. And the city tries to work. We're modernizing our housing department. We've gotten online. We're using technology now, and we're trying to make the inspection process more transparent and more objective, so that it's not necessarily based on the whim of which housing inspector you've got looking at your house. A couple other things I'll mention on the housing front. While we've got home sales that are at record highs, I think, or at least the number of days on the market are at record lows, and most of the transfers are happening without point of sale violations. We still do have vacant lots and foreclosures that we're working through, and we've got a side lot program which has in the last 2 or 3 years just taken off, which means residents who are next to a city-owned vacant lot, often where a house has been demolished, are able to acquire it, assuming that there are no other. We have some criteria that have to be met, but there are no other developers interested in rebuilding. A neighbor can acquire that lot basically for free, And this is a way to increase wealth in a measurable way. You're acquiring land for folks often who don't have generational wealth to depend upon. And actually, well, now we are getting new home development, but I think that side lot program has been really beneficial for residents in our community.
Yeah, no. I love hearing that. I think that's some really great examples of ways you're working to solve this housing crisis. I know it's top of mind for many communities out there, as well for us as the Realtors Association. We're always kind of looking for innovative and new ways to solve some of the issues we're experiencing with housing. So no, I think that's great. So if you had to, create your version or your perfect or most ideal version of Shaker Heights, say maybe 10, 20 years down the road, what would that look like for you?
Well, that's a great question. And I could probably go on and on about it. I will try to be brief. I think I would start, let me finish up on the housing thing, which is because we're also diversifying our housing stock. We've got a couple of new apartment towers in Shaker Heights, one 15 stories, one 18 stories at this new Van Aken district, which was an engineering nightmare of an intersection. And we've reconfigured it now. And there's a really successful mixed use development at the corner of Warrensville and Chagrin, where the Van Aken rapid transit line ends. So it's a transit oriented mixed use development. We got 2 apartment towers are going up there. So we will have, in my idealized Shaker Heights, there'll be diversified housing stock so that people who are aging out of their beautiful 100-year-old homes can move into a condo or maybe a first floor bedroom. And young people will want to come and live in a more vibrant part of town. And we will have a Lee Road corridor. So we also have a road that runs north-south through the city of Shaker Heights. It's a big connecting street on the east side, and it goes into the city of Cleveland. But a Lee Road corridor that has all the storefronts filled with small Shaker businesses and a much better connection to one of the neighborhood parks there. That's a part of town that's been forgotten for many years, and we're embarking on a really exciting effort to try to transform that road. It's a dangerous road to drive on, to walk on, to bike on. So that'll be something that we will be improving over the next few years. I mean, we also need to maintain, I haven't talked about our infrastructure yet, but our 100-year-old trees, sewers, parks and lakes. We've got wonderful lakes in Shaker. Those all take lots and lots of maintenance and effort to repair. We're going to need to rely on regional partnerships to address those. And of course, obviously, if you want to talk about how Shaker is going to look in 20, 30 years, I hope that we've made even greater strides on some of those intangible things I talked about earlier, building community and making everybody feel welcome regardless of your background.
Yeah, and I think, you'll get there for sure. It sounds like there's a lot of great things in the works that's going to make, this an even stronger community than what it is already. But, despite all the improvements and challenges that you face, Shaker Heights was named, I want to say 1 or 2 years ago, maybe, as one of the best suburbs in America to live in, which is crazy that it's an Ohio town, which I think is awesome. But in your perspective in living in Shaker and being a member of the community, what do you think makes it so great? Or what's some of your favorite things about the community, and why is it so desirable that, it's one of the best places in the country to live in?
Yeah, well, I don't have enough time to answer that the way I'd like to, but I guess I start with the parks, which I mentioned there a minute ago. We have 4 beautiful lakes in the city. We've got streams. We got baseball fields that are embedded in our neighborhoods. So we got in proximity to downtown Cleveland. We still do have the rapid transit, although, as I said, it's an aging mode of transportation, and we're hoping maybe we can bring some other means of mobility into the city. And we've got electric charging stations that are cropping up in the city. So we're doing a lot of innovative stuff. But it's what I like the most about Shaker is that it's a city that is trying really hard. We are not a utopia. I think sometimes Shaker can be easy to criticize because sometimes because we have a national reputation, and we get a lot of publicity, and we tend to tout our successes, and that's as we should. But we're certainly not perfect. But we're striving, and we acknowledge where we've fallen short. And because I'm extremely biased, some of my closest friends I've met in grade school and high school, and just remarkable people that you meet when you're in a community like this, and the opportunities, which aren't always taken, but are definitely there, to meet people from different backgrounds and play sports with people who look completely different than you, have completely different backgrounds, and you guys become friends and comrades, so to speak, for life. You don't have those opportunities in many places in America. So that to me is the biggest selling point of Shaker, that it's a city that's not lived up to its aspirations, but we're working really hard.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the fact that, it's been around for over 100 years and has a bright future ahead, I think that says something too, that you do have such that rich history that you can fall back upon, remember and learn from, and hopefully plan, for lack of a better word, plan for an even better and awesome future. So I'm excited for all things to come for Shaker. I'm a little bit of personal bias here because I love historic cities, and I was reading, just planning for this episode, and saw that like 75% of the city is registered on historical databases. So I just think that that's really cool too, and you all have done a wonderful job of keeping that history and tradition alive, which I think is awesome, and like you mentioned, not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and actually, I'll mention one thing which is in the news these days relating to history. It's all the things that I talked to and encapsulated really into one. Horseshoe Lake is kind of our founding spot in some respects. That's where the Shakers created a dam. Well, they created another dam further west a couple decades earlier, but the dam at Horseshoe Lake has a really emotional spot for a lot of us in Shaker, because that's where the Shaker community really started. And it's a beautiful, peaceful lake, or it has been for many years. But it's 170, I think, year old dam that is keeping that lake, or has been keeping that lake together. And the dam has basically failed. It is no longer viable. And so we've been in conversations with the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. It's the regional entity that's tasked with stormwater management. And they have offered to... We have another larger lake downstream. They've offered to rebuild the dam at the larger lake downstream, but they will not pay to rebuild the dam at the Horseshoe Lake location, because they can't, they in their view, can't justify spending the magnitude of funds required to fix something that doesn't have as great a stormwater management benefit for the whole region. So Shaker is facing the decision whether to spend basically $20 million of our own money. We would have to borrow sums of that magnitude, or restore Horseshoe Lake to its historic state, which was two streams running through the land there and heading down the Doan Brook up towards Lake Erie. And it's a really difficult issue. None of us on council or in the administration, wanted to face something like this. I didn't run for city council trying to get rid of Horseshoe Lake. But when you think about climate change, when you think about what's the way we should prioritize our resources, I don't know that I could, unless there's a better alternative presented, justify borrowing that sum of money when we have so many other priorities we want to spend on economic development, maybe some kind of a community center that could bring people together for sports and recreation. It's hard to justify that, but whatever we do at Horseshoe Lake, I can assure you, because I'm going to be on the planning commission, hopefully, that looks at this. If it is decommissioned as a lake, we'll make sure that we preserve the history there in some fashion. That we have some maybe we can preserve some of the stonework that went into the original earthen dam that kept Horseshoe Lake together. So we all have a soft spot for Horseshoe Lake, and it's been a really challenging issue for us as public officials in the last couple months.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's tough. That's tough. But I think, like you said, just keeping the spirit and the history of it alive, no matter what happens, I think everyone will be glad to hear that, and certainly can be all on the same page with that. That would be a great Real View answer. I'm like, I want to go see Horseshoe Lake. I want to see the view of the Horseshoe Lake.
Well, the city has had on its homepage, and we have every time we do a Zoom call, lots of folks have their backgrounds with this terrific view, a drone view of Horseshoe Lake in the fall. The foliage is reflecting on the water, and you can see all the way down to the city of Cleveland. You just see a bunch of trees, and you see all the way to the city of Cleveland. So yes, if I was trying to be Pandering here. I would have said that's my favorite view, but I was.
But Ireland's pretty cool too. Well, Sean, this was so great. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing a little bit about your city and what makes it unique and maybe what makes it just like, some other cities in America. I certainly think some of the topics you touched on today will resonate with our listeners. So thank you so much for sharing your experience. Thanks for all your work as a city council member and keeping the spirit in the history of Shaker alive. And thanks for joining me today. It was great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you, and thanks for being willing to shine the spotlight on Shaker Heights.
Thank you for listening to The Real View. That wraps up today's episode. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at ohiorealtors.org/therealview and on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Have questions, comments, or suggestions? We want to hear from you. Email us at podcast@ohiorealtors.org. We'll see you next time.
This has been a Humble Pod production. Stay humble.